Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin, Daf Kuf Yutet. Today's daf is sponsored by Maya Zanger Shamir in loving memory of Sarah Nedes, Sarah Bat Esther. She passed away just over a week shy of her 100th birthday. She was the best Safta math tutor and gourmet baker. We're going to get started with the machloket. We're going to spend the whole first part of today's daf with this debate between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, I just want to remind you of this machloket and maybe add one other point that's important to understand here. Rav says that ein yad lepachot mikazayit ve'ein shomer lepachot mikifol. In order for something to be considered a yad or something to be considered a shomer, there's a minimum amount of what it's being used to hold or what it's protecting. And because the protector, as we saw in the earlier sugya, is stronger because it protects and the yad doesn't, so the protector is on a smaller amount and the yad is on a larger amount. Okay, it needs to be at least a kazayit, and the shomer needs to be at least a full, right, the size of a bean. Okay, it's a pretty big bean. It's much bigger than, let's say, a lentil, but it's still the size of a bean, which is much smaller than even half an olive bulb. So that's Rav's position. Now I want to, and then Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you mean? Yesh yad lepachot mikazayit, yesh shomer lepachot mikiful. You don't need that kind of requisite amount. He doesn't say if there's a difference between them, and maybe you need more for a yad than for a shomer, but he says you definitely don't need the shiurim that Rav is talking about. Maybe he doesn't require any minimum amount, we're not sure, but he definitely doesn't require what Rav requires. Now, you might be asking, and this is a question the commentaries ask, is, wait a minute, don't you need a kibetza of food? How are you going to get to a kibetza of food if you have a yad on something that's less than a kazayit or a shomer on something that's less than a full? Even if the shomer, now yad, if you remember, doesn't join the requisite amount. Shomer, that was the whole point of yesterday's daf, that a shomer is mitzvah. If the yad is not, so if a yad is on something less than a kazayit, then you don't have a kibetza. So if you remember, there's a machloket we talked about whether it needs, the food can be any kind of amount in order for tumah to become panid. It just needs a kibetza, the size of an egg, to pass on impurity. Or there was some, and then you could say maybe this whole sugya is talking about, okay, there's less than a kibetza, but we're only talking about becoming impure, not passing on impurity, because for that there's no requisite amount. So then what about the commentaries who say that even to become tameh, you need a kibetza? So then you have to explain, and there's different explanations commentaries give about this, but that it must be that somehow this is together with other food, and then the question is in what way are they together to be able to count this all as one requisite amount. So in other words, what it means is we have a yad with the item that's a kazayit or less than a kazayit according to Rabbi Yochanan, or the shomer with that, plus it's next to other food, and altogether that's a kibetza. Just so you don't get confused about it, because it's confusing. Why are we talking about kazayit full when you really need a kibetza? But those are two separate issues sort of that have to kind of connect, but that's only if this food is with other food. Is it going to be counted? Because maybe, right, if the yad, let's say, is touching, but the food is not, and yad is together with that, will we count it for the shiur of a kibetza? Okay, that's just a side point that I think just needs to be asked here, because otherwise it's a little confusing what the sugya is talking about. Now we're going to have 4 difficulties. The first 2 are going to be on Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and the second 2 are only on Rav. So shnei atzamot, you really have to keep in your head that for a yad, you need a kazayit. According to Rav, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you don't. For a shomer, you need it to be the size of a bean, okay? And Rabbi Yochanan thinks you don't. So now comes this difficulty from a Tosefta in Ohalot. We have 2 bones. On each bone, there's a half a zayit, so that shouldn't be an amount that works for a yad, according to Rav. Okay, the commentary, the notes on the side of the box changes it to hashnayim. Okay, he puts the heads of both of them into the house, but not the part with the meat on it. Right? And we're talking about from a dead body, a person's dead body, and the house makes a tent over these bones. The bayit's tameh, even though the flesh, which is the part that's really matame, is outside, because this seems to function as a yad. And that obviously, right now, what does it say here? Half a zayit. That doesn't seem to go with Rav. Yehuda ben Akos omer mishum Rabbi Yochanan he'ach shnei atzamot mitzarfim lekazayit. Yehuda ben Akos says, how could these both join together for a kazayit? Each one doesn't have the din of a yad. Now that sounds like Rav. But despite that, we could just easily say Rav holds like Yehuda ben Akos. At first, they want to kind of ask it as a question and say, Rav, hi b'mayim okimla. How's he going to explain this? Now, what I didn't mention yesterday is that there's two different kinds of bones that could be functioning here. One is a yad, that's what I said. There's bone on one side, meat on the end of it. Okay, and the part without the meat was the part that went inside. But you could have a bone with marrow inside. The marrow is considered food, and then the bone is a shomer. It's protecting it. So, yad kasher reisha. If it's a yad, then the reisha doesn't make sense because the Tanakama says that it works, and it doesn't have a kazayid. How could it be a yad? Shomer kasher seifa. Now, if you think it's a yad with a bone with marrow in it, then all you need is for it to be the shear of a fool, right, of this bean. And if it needs to be the shear of a bean, well, a bean is less than half an olive bulk. So this should actually work. So why did Yehuda ben Akosa say it doesn't work? So, we can explain it according to either. You could say it's a yad, Yehuda ben Akosa. You could say it's a yad, and he holds like Yehuda ben Akosa that doesn't work. And that's very simple. That's how I read it the first time. Or you could say that Rav reads it, that it's talking about a shomer, and he holds like Tanakama, that this works because it's bigger than the size of a bean. Rabbi Yochanan, now how's Rabbi Yochanan going to explain this? Because Rabbi Yochanan says you don't even need. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, okay, so let's just look. For sure, Yehuda ben Akosa doesn't work because he says this wouldn't work. And of course, Rabbi Yochanan is going to think this works. So that's what they're going to say. Rabbi Yochanan, Amar, it's definitely not Yehuda ben Akosa, but you could say kula biyad. It must be talking about a yad, Yehuda Amar Katanakama. Now, so what are we going to say? It's talking about a yad, and he holds like Tanakama that it works because you don't need a whole zayit. Half a zayit's fine. Now, you could say it's shomer, and you don't need a zayit, a whole olive bulk, because even less than a fool is good. But then the assumption is, now, you could have said this, and theoretically that could be an answer. But this assumption is that if that was enough, they would have brought an example with even less on the bone and brought that example, and that would have proven Rabbi Yochanan better, and therefore he explains better to explain it as yad. Tashma, second source. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, kulit sheyesh alav kezayit basar, goreret kula letuma. If you have a kulit, the bone of the upper thigh, which has a kezayit of basar, okay, it has this. We're talking presumably about either tumat ochlin or tumat nevela, and it has a kezayit of flesh on it because we're talking about an animal. Goreret kula letuma. So this bone passes on impurity, right, to the rest of it. Achirim omrim afilu ein. Now notice it says in Tanakama's position you need a kezayit. Achirim omrim, others say afilu ein aleh ela kefol goreret kula letuma. Even if it's only the size of a bean, it still works. So Rav, hi b'may mokimla. So Rav, now we're going to say again, this doesn't make sense according to Rav, because ibiyad, same kind of question as before, even though it's a bit of a strange question, because I don't know why you have to say it has to fit with both opinions, right? But anyway, they ask it. Ibiyad kasha seifa. If you're talking about the yad, he thinks you need a kazayid. And the second position was you don't even need a full. Or even, actually, it said, even if it's only a full, it will work, even if it's only the size of a bean. And Rav says you need it to be a kazayid. Shomer, if it's talking about a shomer, kasha reisha, because for a shomer, Rav only requires, right, if it's protecting, he only requires a smaller amount of fool. It wouldn't need to be, right, the size of a bean. He wouldn't need it to be the size of an olive bulk. So, so now we're going to explain it both ways, and that he holds by a different position each time, right? Biyad, you could say it's talking about a yad, where again, the bone had a piece of meat at the end of it. And then he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says, because it's a yad, you need a kazayit. That's the kulit sheyesh alai kazayit basar. Then it works. And that's exactly Rav. Or, and then you read acherim as, even if it doesn't have a full, goreret kula letuma, but it needs to have a full, right? So that's Rav by din of shomer. It needs a full, and that would work, the size of a bean. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kula b'shnei. Rabbi Yochanan definitely can't fit with Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says you need a kazayit. He doesn't think you need a kazayit for anything. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar kula b'shomer. The whole thing's talking about a shomer. Again, the kuli bone has the marrow inside, and it touched the bone, not the marrow. It would pass on impurity if it was. Now look, Acherim said even if it doesn't have a full, right? Even if it's less than a kazayit, but has a fool, well, he holds like a cherim. So he holds like them that it's enough to have a fool. Now, this is a little tricky. because acherim hakeful ka'amre, but acherim sound like you need a fool. Now, what did Rabbi Yochanan say? You don't even need a fool for a shomer. Right? You don't even need that amount. Less is fine. So they say, well, acherim is a little tricky to read. I'm just going to go back to the line of acherim. Afilu ein aleha ela kefol goreret kula l'tuma. Even if it doesn't have on it but a foal. Now, we assume that meant it needs to have the size of a bean. But maybe it means even if it doesn't even have a full, maybe even if it doesn't have even that amount. Okay? And why did he use the language of a fool as opposed to the Rabbi Yehuda, who used the language of a kazayit? He was trying to say, Adit Kamar Tanakama, which is Rabbi Yehuda, said Shiura, since he gave a shiur of a kazayit, Kamar Inu Nami Shiura. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, you'd have to read it like this. I want you to notice that what we did in this sugya is we said maybe it's talking about a yad, and then, Rav holds like the position of Rabbi Yehuda, or he holds like a cherem and it's talking about a shomer. And then we said Rabbi Yehuda also holds like a cherem and it's a shomer. We're reading that same line for both of them. How can we possibly do that? And the answer is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rav, we're going to read it as it needs a fool, though. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to say even if it's not the size of a bean, they said the size of a bean since Rabbi Yehuda brought the olive book. He said you don't even need a fool, but you don't even need even a fool. But what he really meant is you don't even need a fool. He was just trying to give a lower amount, some requisite amount, and say even much lower. But he really meant it could be anything. Doesn't matter what size it is, and that's how Rabbi Yehuda would read it. So we now have two ways of reading this source. Two ways according to Rav, but the second way according to Rav, then both Rav and Rabbi Yochanan could read this as talking about a shomer, but one reads it as it needs to have the shiur of a fool, and the other one reads it as it doesn't even need that amount. Okay, and now we're going to see. Okay, we're going to have 2 points. One is Rava, Amar Rava, Daikanami de B'shomer Askinan. The second interpretation that we explained according to Rava, and the only interpretation we have for Rabbi Yochanan, was it was talking about a shomer. Well, that makes sense. The Katani Kulid, and a Kulid is a bone that generally has marrow. So, Shma Mina. So that's a better interpretation. And now we're going to bring up a machloket between two Amoraim, one of them being Rabbi Yochanan, about how to understand how to read the Acherim's position, the exact same 2 ways we saw it a minute ago. Rabbi Chanina Amar Zehu Shiur, or Itmar, it was said. Rabbi Chanina Amar Zehu Shiur. He's referring back to the Acherim. When the Acherim said, even if it doesn't have even a foal, the size of a bean, it meant Zehu Shiur. That is the amount it needs. It needs a requisite amount, though, of the size of a bean. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ein Zeh Shiur. Rabbi Yochanan said, that's not meant to be taken seriously. He doesn't really mean it needs exactly that amount. It means it doesn't even need that. Ein Zeh Shiur, hakatani kefol, but how could you read it that way? It says it needs to be a full, right? Unless it has just a full, that would work. So again, they answered, this is just as if you didn't see the last sugya. I did Kamar Tanakama Shiura, Kamar Inu Nami Shiura, because Tanakama, meaning Rabbi Yehuda, gave a requisite amount of a kazayit, so he used a full, but he didn't really mean it literally, that it needs to be that amount. So there you have 2 sources that we had to explain both according to Rav and both according to Rabbi Yochanan. Each time we explained it, either it's a yad or it's a shomer. Again, meaning either it had marrow or it didn't have marrow, right? Did have marrow, it would be a shomer. Didn't have marrow, it would be a yad. And then you had to explain who holds by what position, depending on whether you say it was talking about a yad or a shomer. Now we're going to have 2 more sources, which are actually going to appear in the next section as well. And the Gemara is making reference to that later section in here. You'll see in a minute. 2 sources that are going to be a difficulty just according to Rav, who says, again, if you have a yad, it needs to be minimally a kazayit to function as a yad, to be able to pass on impurity and accept impurity. And according to if it's a shomer, then it's going to need to be the size of this bean, this full bean, okay, which is a bigger size bean. We're going to see that right now. Now they're talking here in a Mishnah in Uktzin about pods with peas inside. Okay, now we have pods with big peas, with the full-size peas, and we have pods with teeny peas in them, kidney, okay, legumes. And they're smaller peas. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mitaher. Okay, so first of all, if you have just the pod by itself, it's not going to be mitame. If you have a pod with something in it, it will be. Okay, but then the pod will function as a shomer. But comes Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and he says, He says it depends what is in the pod. If it's a big bean, then you don't need a protection for it. What is protection? It protects in case it gets crushed, in case it gets full of lots of dirt. There's all these psolet always mixed in with it, like well, the stuff like when you buy, if you want to clean out lentils or something, there's all these, garbage pieces in it. So he says in pole, you don't really need the protective pod because they're big enough that it's easy to keep clean. It's easy to hold them without crushing them. Whereas mitameh b'shel kitnid, but in a kitnid, he says if you touch the pod, it's going to make the kitnid impure or pass on impurity in any which way you can pass on impurity, because when you want to touch them, you need the pod to protect it. So what do you see here? According to this, now what happens? Why is this a problem with Rav? Because Rav says a pod, which is a shomer, would need to be shomer on something that's at least the size of a pole, right? This bean. If you say the kitnid is smaller, and that's specifically where you have a law of shomer, then you have something protecting something that's teeny, and we're calling it a shomer. That goes against Rav. Okay, it's certainly not a difficulty for Rabbi Yochanan. To which they answer, Keda'amar Rav Acha Berei de Rava. Now, this is the Mishnah, by the way, in Uktzin. Rav Acha Berei de Rava, he explained that Mishnah in Uktzin because of a different issue, which we're going to see on Amud Bet, Bekulcha umishum yad. He said, we're not talking about one pod protecting one kitnid inside of it. We're talking about a stalk with lots of pods on it, and in each pod there's one kitnid. And then it's a yad that you're holding the yad. Now, with the yad, you're holding the stalk, and we're talking about the stalk passing on impurity to all the pods that have the kitnid in them. And then altogether, you have a yad for, a lot of stuff, because you have a lot in the end of kitniot there, and they all add up to the requisite amount that Rav needs, which would be a kazayit. Okay, so we're not talking about one lone pod with one lone kitnid inside. We're talking about many pods with kitnid in them and a stalk holding them all, and he's talking about the yad. Like that Mishnah is talking about the yad. Now you have to explain one word. My b'mashmishan. Why does it say b'mashmishan? When you touch the kitniyot, right? You rather touch it through the pod. Here you're not even touching the pod. B'tashmishan. What it means is for its use, meaning for carrying it. Okay, and that's the yad, the stalk. Tashma, fourth source that seems to go against Rav. Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael again. Rav said for a shomer it has to be the size of a bean. Well, what about this? The whole law of Shomrim Mitzdaref. What did we learn? This was yesterday's daf. Tana debei Rabbi Yishmael. Kol zera zeru asher yizareah. Kederach shebenei adam motzim. Klipa b'klipata. Klita b'klipata. Sora b'klipata. Dashim b'klipatan. We learn the whole source of Shomer from the peel around a grain of wheat, or a grain of barley, or a grain of a legume. Now, a grain of lentil. Now that peel is around something that's teeny, much smaller than the size of a bean. So how could you possibly say that that's a shomer? So the answer, bria shani, that's different because that's around a complete item. When we were saying a shomer has to be protecting something that's the size of a full, we're talking about if it's a bunch of things inside there that it's protecting, let's say a hide, a piece of skin that's protecting meat, well, the meat has to be a certain requisite amount. But that's not, its own entity. So that's just a piece of meat. So if it's a whole complete entity, then you wouldn't need a requisite amount for it to be considered a shomer. Okay, so 4 difficulties. 2 were on Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. 2 were on Rav alone, and we resolved them all. Now we're going to have a second part of today's sugya, which is by Rav Oshai. Rav Oshai asked the following question, turning out Amud Bet. Shnei shomrim maushi yitztarfu. What if I have 2 shomrim? Can we join them together? Can we say, I have 2 shomrim, and Rashi says, to get to the shiur of kibetza. Okay, so I have 2 shomrim. They're each protecting something else. Can I say the shomer plus what it's protecting, plus the shomer and what it's protecting will count together? Or maybe not. Okay, the truth is I'm jumping the gun a little because we don't exactly understand the question yet. Hey chidami, what's the case? The Gemara asks. Ilema bezel gavzef. We're talking about one on top of the other. Like let's say you have, well, they're going to give an example of an onion, okay, but you have one layer of peel and then another layer of peel before you get to the actual vegetable. So if you want to say shnei shomrim, can we put them together? In that kind of case, that's certainly not the question because mi'ika shomer al gav shomer. That's a shomer on top of a shomer. It's got two layers of protection, and we don't call both layers protection. Okay, they're not both shomrim. Okay, we only call, we're going to see now, the inner one protective. V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, shalosh klipot babatzal. Okay, onions have layers, right? We all know that. So all sorts of jokes made about that, right? Even Shrek. But onions have many layers, and we're going to talk about three of the layers. What they mean here is the three outer layers, which is the pnimi, the inner one, which is the inner one that's the outermost layer that can be eaten. Bein shlema bein k'dura mitzarefet. It's going to be considered as part of the requisite amount. Let's say you have an onion and you have that layer on it. That's going to count whether it's whole or whether it has holes in it. Okay, whole, two different holes, right? Whether it's complete or whether it's got holes in it. Because it's food. It doesn't matter if it has holes in it. We'll see the relevance of the holes in a second. And sa'id, the middle one, which means the one outside of that layer, which is already, right, when you peel an onion, you often peel off the outside layer, and then you peel off, you see, oh, I really have to peel another layer because that still has stuff on it. So that one that really we don't eat any because it's got that, thin, it's not really edible so much. Shleima mitzarefet k'dura ein mitzarefet. Well, that has a law of a shomer. Now, a shomer is only going to protect something if it has no holes in it. So if it's complete, then it joins because then it's a shomer. If it's not complete, it has holes in it, then it doesn't combine. You can't count it in the requisite amount. Because remember, a shomer is mitzaref. That was yesterday's stuff. Chitzona, but the outer layer, ben kach uben kach tohora. Either which way, it's going to be pure because the outer layer is a shomer on top of a shomer. So it doesn't matter. You could have the middle layer totally complete, the outer layer totally complete, but that doesn't join because that's a shomer on top of a shomer. So for sure, Rav Oshaya didn't ask a question about that because it's obvious the answer would be no. So Rav Oshaya shomer ocha shechilko kamebaile. He was talking about a shomer of food that was divided. Let's say you have a piece of meat with skin on it, and you split it in half. And now you have two halves. You have a piece of meat with a hide and a piece of meat with skin and a piece of meat with skin. You have two shomrim together. Now one, the skin of that one is not protecting the meat of the other. And the skin of that piece of meat is not protecting the meat of the other. Lo mitzdarfin, so maybe they don't combine. Or maybe because each one protects its own, they do join together. So what are we going to bring? The last two sources we're going to bring to try to get to an answer. In the end, I'll already tell you, we're going to reject both as being answers for the same reasons we rejected them previously, or maybe a different one. We're going to see one of them for the same reason, one of them for a different. And we're going to end up with no answer to this question. At first, they're going to try. Tashma, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mitahel b'shel pol u'mishamei b'shel kitni mipnei sherotzeh b'mashmishan. Now, if you say this pod with a kitnit inside is going to work as a shomer, okay, then what do you see here? Now, in this case, we're going to assume there must be multiple ones because one is not going to be enough to get to a kibetza. So we must have a bunch of pods with the kitnit, and each one's protecting its own legume, and they all combine. To which they say, and this is where he said it. If you remember, we quoted in the previous page that Rav Acha B'rei Rava already explained that Mishnah in this way. Now we're going to see he explained it to reject this as an answer to Rav Oshaya's question. Rav Acha B'rei Rava bekuchu mishum yad. This has nothing to do with shomer. And then Rav Oshaya's question was about a shomer. There's nothing to do with the shomer. There's a yad, and it's the stalk that's holding many pods. Umay b'mashmishan. And then how do you explain the word mashmishan? If so, because we thought it was protecting it from you touching it. Well, bitashmishan. It's to be able to use it with this, which means to carry it through the stalk. Okay. Tashma. Second source, which we also just read. Ditana debei Rabbi Yishmael. Kol zera zerua asher yizavea. Kederach shebnei adam motziim lizriach. Hita b'klipata, sora b'klipata, dashim b'klipata. Now again, if you're going to say this adds up to a kibetza, one wheat with its shell is not going to add up to a kibetza. It must be there's multiple ones together, way more than two shomrim, and they all add up to the requisite amount, and it seems like they obviously join together. So they say, well, just like in the previous source, Rav Acha said we can say it was a stalk holding together many of them. Maybe. Now there we said it was yad. Here we could say it's still shomer, but it's completely different from what we thought. It's not one grain of wheat with its peel, but it's the whole, how do wheat grows? Wheat grows in a stalk, and in it there's a cluster of wheat grains, and they're all shomrim of each other, because if you take one out, they're all joined together, they all fall out. So they're all actually protecting each other, and therefore it's one unit. And it's not two different shomrim together. They're all shomrim of each other. So the Gemara says, wait a minute. Bishlama elita tzricha latatyata. The upper ones need the bottom ones. If you take out the bottom ones, the upper ones will fall out. But elatatyata might tzricha liiliata. But the bottom ones don't need the upper ones, so they're not really all protecting each other, because the bottom ones will stay in place even if you take off the top ones of the cluster. So the answer, b'chad dara, we're talking about one row. In one row of the grains, if you take out one, they'll all fall out. Umi ika kebetza ochlin b'chad dara. But wait, if you have to get to a kebetza, how can you say that one row of these grains is going to add up to the size of an egg? No way, no how. Well, b'chite de Shimon ben Shatach. They say in the time of Shimon ben Shatach, it's in the time of the early Mishnaic times, there's a Gemara in Ta'anit that says, in the time of Shimon ben Shatach, there was such blessing that all the produce was huge. And then we must have had grains that were much bigger, and one row would add up to an olive bulk, to which the Gemara says, Hashadati lahachi, if already you're going to go there, Chadachi tanami, you could explain it one grain itself. You can go back to understanding Rabbi Yishmael simply. One grain with its peel was already, B'chitei Shimon ben Shatach, they were already so big that it was the size of an egg. That's how gigantic they were. It sounds like in the time of the spies, right? When they talk about those huge fruits that they brought back. So in any case, we had two attempts, one from the Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah with the pod, and the other with Rabbi Yishmael and the grain with the peel, that we tried to say, oh, it's a shomer and it's less. What do you see here? It's less than it. Kebetza must be, it joins with the other ones, and Shnei Shomrim Maush Yitztarfu. But one we said it must be talking about a yad, not a shomer, and in this one we said it's talking about a shomer, but a shomer within, right, the whole row, which was a kebetza, or maybe even just one itself was a kebetza, as in the time of Shimon ben Shatach. Okay, gufa. Now we go back to the source that we ended with yesterday's daf. שני עצמות עליהם שני חצי זיתים והכניס ראשיהן השניים לבית, והבית מאכיל עליהם הבית טמא. So according to the Tanakama, if you have two bones, and again, they're functioning as, we said, either a yad or a shomer. There were two ways of interpreting it, but let's just go with the yad. And the house, right? Basically, you have the part of the bone that doesn't have the meat on it is inside the house, but the meat is attached to the other side. The meat, the flesh from a dead body, person's dead body, we're going to have the whole house become tameh. Yehuda ben Nekosa said, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, they don't have enough in each bone. It's only half a zayit of meat on each one. He says, they don't have enough. It's not going to work. However, both would assume that if there was a kazayit of meat, both would agree that it would work, that even though the part of the bone that's inside is the part that doesn't have the meat on it, the flesh, well, impurity would be passed on because it has an olive bulk. On that point comes Rish Lakish, Amar Rish Lakish, Lo shanu ela etzem dehav yad. This would only work for a bone because a bone functions as a yad. Aval nima lo hav yad. But what if you had a hair, okay, like a hair on the skin, on the hot, right, and then you have the meat underneath? That would not, or not underneath, but attached somehow, okay? That would not be a yad. Okay, nima lo hav yad, presumably because people don't hold things by a hair. Okay, that wouldn't function as a yad. A bone, yes, but not a hair. Okay, again, hair on the skin, that's on the meat. Okay, we're going to have to talk about this because it's a little bit strange, but we'll see there's some issues here. Rabbi Yochanan amar afilu nami hav yad. Rabbi Yochanan says even a hair could function as a yad. So now, Eitiv Rabbi Yochanan leRish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says to Rish Lakish, or sheyesh alav kazayit basal. Okay, here's a source. Okay, this source says, or sheyesh alav kazayit basal. If you have skin with a kezayit of meat on the skin, attached to the skin. Hanogea b'tziv hayotze mimeno. Okay, this isn't relevant for our purposes, but if there's a stringy piece of hair, stringy piece of meat. This isn't hair. This is meat hanging down. U b'sa'ara shekenegdo, or the hair that's opposite where the meat is, tameh. It's going to be impure. Now they assume comes Rabbi Yochanan. He says, look, the hair makes it impure. Okay, you can pass on impurity through the hair. Ma'ala mishum yad. Is it not because it's a yad? Okay, and then the hair, right? Since you can hold, and this would make sense, right? If you can really hold it by the hair, and that's part of the question here. If you can hold it by the hair, Rabbi Yochanan says it's a yad, and that's how he reads this source. And that would go against Rabbi Yochanan, who says a hair does not function as a yad. So they say, no, mishum shomer. No. The hair they're talking about in this source is a din of shomer, because the hair also protects the meat. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, shomer agabe shomer. This is not shomer. We already learned earlier in today's daf that right, we talked about the two shomerim. It couldn't be one on top of the other. Now the hair is always on the skin. The skin is already the protector. So the hair couldn't be a shomer. So that's not a good answer. To which Rabbi Lakish answers, no, the hair actually directly touches the meat because it makes a hole in the hide. In other words, that's the way hair works. It's actually directly attached to the meat through the hide. It kind of makes this hole in the hide, the Gemara in the skin. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Matkefla Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov comes and says, wait, you're trying to say, Rish Lakish, that the hair is a direct shomer because it goes straight to the meat. It's not on the skin, which is on the meat. If you're going to say that, we have a completely out of left field question. How do we write tefillin on the hide of animals then? Because you need a complete writing, meaning it can't be on something with holes in it. You're saying all the hides have holes in them from the hair that bores holes in them and directly touches the meat. So they say, what do you mean? That's not a question. You forgot what they said in Israel, which is any hole that the ink can fill in the hole is not considered a hole. So this is not a problem, okay? Because when these are teeny holes from the hair, right? A hair follicle makes a teeny hole. That doesn't count as a hole for tefillin. Okay, that was the first explanation, that we have this problem with the Braita, with this Mishnah, that I think it's a Mishnah, I forgot to check, but, or I just don't remember, but anyway, the hair, shekenegdo, is tameh, right? Can make it tameh. How could that be? Well, it's not a yad, it's a shomer. And it's not a shomer on gabe shomer because it goes directly in. Ibait ema, or an alternative answer for Rish Lakish would be kula mishum yad. It really could be a yad. But in other words, Rish Lakish said, in our case, we're talking about one hair isn't going to work. That can't function as a yad because you don't hold it that way. But just like Rabbi Ela said somewhere else, that we're going to have one among many, meaning, okay, we're going to talk about this in a minute, what he means. So hold off for 1 second. Just like Rabbi Ela answered some question in a different case, he's talking about the stalks of wheat and the hairs at the top of the stalks of wheat. Now there he was saying one among many, meaning you were holding it by all of them, and that could function as a yad. Also here, we're not talking about one hair. In that source that you brought as difficulty to me, Rish Lakish says it's many hairs, and many hairs you can use as a yad, and then it would function as a yad. I was talking about one hair, what doesn't work as a yad. Hey chayit mar de Rabbi Eli, where did he say that? He said it on this. Milai shebeshibolim mitamim umitamim ve'inam mitzdarfim. Those hairs on the shibolim, on the stalks of wheat, pass on impurity. They can become impure, okay? And they can't combine, though, to get to the requisite amount. Why is that? Again, go back to yesterday's sugya. Yad in food doesn't combine, but shomer does. So obviously he views these as yad, because they're not mitzdarfim. Now, milai lamai chaze, what are they worthy of? What are you going to do with those hairs? They're very thin. He's talking about when there's one among many, and then you can hold them all, and they become a yad. Okay, and therefore, just like he said it there, Rish Lakish says you can answer here. So either he says that's sort of talking about a shomer, okay, it's not even a yad, and that doesn't raise difficulty for me because the hair is actually protective, Or you say it's a yad, but it was talking about many hairs, and I was talking about one hair. Now, Ikad Amre, Lishna Achrina, there's a different version that in the middle of the conversation, when he tried to say it was talking about a shomer, then the first answer, he said, in other words, instead of answer number 2 being an option, we're going to use something said in answer number 2 as part of strengthening answer number 1. You'll see in a minute what I mean. Hachinami mistaber de mishum shomer. It must be that it's clearly a shomer there when it said, B'sarasha kenegdo tamei, because because if it was talking about yad, what on earth could one hair be usable for? To which Rabbi Yochanan answers him, what do you mean? I'll tell you how to read it like yad. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? You're trying to prove that it's shomer, because what else can you do with a yad? I can claim that source, instead of Rish Lakish saying, I'm going to explain the source talking about many, I can say that this source is talking about yad, and you can't prove that it's shomer, because I could say it was many hairs. And then, again, because this is in place of the second version, the Gemara then has to say, okay, well, where did he say that? It's not on what it says in the Mishnah. Mitamim. They become impure. They can pass on impurity. They can pass on impurity. No. Mitamim, they can become impure. Umitamim, and they can make other things impure. And they don't combine. Milai lamaycha. Say, what is this? These hairs, what are they usable for? Am Rabbi Eli b'milai sheben amleim. Okay, that was just to explain where Rabbi Eli said it, as we already saw. Okay, finish the daf. What do we do today? We started with these 4 difficulties, 2 on Rav and Rabbi Yochanan's position about what's the minimum amount required in a yad or a shomer, and for each one a different amount. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan doesn't require either any amount, or it doesn't certainly require the amount that Rav required. And then we had 2 difficulties against both of them, resolve them. 2 difficulties against Rav, resolve them. We went to this question of Rav Shaya, Shnei Shomrim, can they combine? First, we had to explain what the question is. Then once we had the question, we said, oh, maybe you could learn it from these 2 sources, which were the last 2 that we had as difficulties on Rav. And then we said, no, because you can explain them in other ways. Then we went back to the Shnei Atzamot, and then we had this comment of Rish Lakish on it, which is we're talking about only bones, we're not talking about hair. And then Rabbi Yochanan said even hair, and then we had this difficulty Rabbi Yochanan raised against Rish Lakish, and either there were 2 answers to Rish Lakish, or there was one answer where Rish Lakish tried to prove his answer, and then Rabbi Yochanan questioned it and said, that's not a good proof, because you could explain it as one hair among many, just like in this other case that Rabbi Eli used. What we saw used a bunch of times today is the same way somebody used that answer somewhere else. We're going to take it and use it for our purposes here. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day.